This morning we're in an early model JK with an LT1 and a 10-speed. Might be an L86. As you guys know, I think this is the top of the line, and I had this Jeep up to Utah last weekend, and I was thinking to myself, so much of the enjoyment of this powertrain is this transmission, because when you get a heavy vehicle, you don't want it to struggle going up the grades and just accelerating in general, especially when you have a heavy Jeep with bigger tires. And this 10-speed just makes the power output so effortless, so low stressed. So I think the transmission is a overlooked part of some of these engine conversions. Again, I think the 10-speed is top of the line in any of the engine conversions out today. And I started off way back. Some of my first transmissions were power slides, 2-speed power glide GM transmissions. And power slide really is a appropriate term, because really these are fluid coupled powertrains. When you come to a stop, the engine's going to keep running, so something has to give in the transmission, and that's the torque converter. It's a fluid drive. There's a lot of advantages to an automatic, and then of course there's some disadvantages. Now I will say, back in the day, back when I was into muscle cars and I had 69 Z28s and 70 Challengers and Hemis, the 4-speed was king, because automatic transmissions back then were not nearly as efficient as they are today. They didn't have the diverse gearing. Now of course, way back in the 60s, 3 in the tree was a common thing. 3 meaning a 3-speed manual, on the tree meaning it was on the steering column. The floor shift really didn't come around until the mid-60s, when most of the muscle cars went to it. So a 4 on the floor, as they called it, or a 4-speed with a shifter on the floor, was really the bomb back then. The good thing about a manual transmission is it used a lot less horsepower than the automatic. The automatics just sucked horsepower up. But the automatics also had something called torque multiplication. And what torque multiplication is basically that slipping, because you could floor it and the converter would slip and slowly bring the power in. You could do the same thing with a manual by slipping the clutch, but there was a lot of problems with that. One, most people couldn't do it, and two, it would cause a lot of heat buildup. There was just a lot of issues launching with manual transmissions. Now, if you knew what you were doing, the manual transmission would most likely be faster than an automatic, given the same engine and vehicle. But it was kind of a thrash. I remember launching my LS6 Chevelle, and you pretty much had to burn the tires for some short period of time to get the maximum power, because that vehicle had a big cam in it, and the power didn't come in until higher up in the RPM band. So if you tried to launch without spinning the tires, you'd bog the engine down. And remember, we didn't have fuel injection back then. So with an automatic, you could basically power brake it, as we called it, or some guys had line locks, and what that would do is allow you to brake the front wheels and spool up the engine, get the RPM higher, and then when you want to launch, you just let the brake off and you take off. And I don't think there really is a faster launch method than that. In fact, most of today's launch sequences, if you look at these high-end cars, Lexuses, Corvettes, that's exactly what they do. So over the years, the automatic got better and better. We went from the 2 speeds to the 3 speeds. Then we went to the 4-speed, then the 5, 6. Now we got 10. And I wasn't a big fan of the really high gear transmissions at first, and I think I have to back up a little bit. 3 speeds is pretty much where Detroit settled for the longest time. And even some of the Europeans used our 3-speed transmissions, like Rolls-Royce used our Hydramatics, and the Ford C6, C4 were used around the world by other manufacturers. The Chrysler, the 727 TorqueFlite, was a great transmission. And they pretty much dominated for decades. But back then, economy wasn't really the biggest deal. So what manufacturers did is they kind of fudged the powertrains. If you had a grocery getter that you wanted good economy, they'd put really tall gears in it. I remember a friend of mine had an El Camino with 270-something, 273s, very, very, very tall gears. And while it worked great on the highway, as you can imagine, it was a little bit sluggish. Then if you had a performance car, you got the 410. The problem with that was, with a 3-speed transmission with a 1-to-1 top gear, you were really screaming the engine on the highway. I remember driving my LS6 from Los Angeles to Vegas with 410s and the stock tires, and they're small. The LS6, I believe, had 14-inch rims, and I was revving that thing 3,000 plus trying to get to Vegas, and with a 454 cubic inch engine with over 11-to-1 compression, it just wasn't a very enjoyable experience for hundreds and hundreds of miles. Now, if we just take a 4-speed and we consider that fourth gear is 1-to-1, that means you're basically going directly through the transmission, from the flywheel, through the transmission, through the drive shaft, to the rear axle. There's very little loss there. At least there's the minimum amount of loss. There's always going to be some loss. You're going through U-joints and gears and all that. But compared to an automatic, which some guys call a slush box, there was a lot more internal drag and friction. So the manuals were always rated at better miles per gallon than the automatics. Now that's been changing lately, and it's really kind of a long story. So we're going to try to keep it to the basics. So in the late 70s, early 80s, the manufacturers realized by putting an overdrive in these 3 speeds, they could bring the RPM down on the highway, get better economy, better emissions, all that, run cooler. So they did. And we're only going to focus here on the GM transmissions because that's what we're concerned with. And the first overdrive transmission that I worked with extensively was a Turbo 700 R4. I really liked the Turbo 700 R4. It was basically a derivative of the Turbo 350, which was a standard GM transmission for most passenger cars and trucks. Now, of course, they have the Turbo 400, which became a force all of its own in the heavy-duty market and drag racing. And you guys remember Art Car and B&M and all these guys making shift kits for them. That's what a lot of the dragsters ran. But the Turbo 350 was kind of the just run-of-the-mill, everyday grocery getter transmission, and it was a great transmission. It was designed well, it was simple, you could rebuild it easily, it was easily modified, but it was limited to those 3 gears. When you have a large displacement engine with long legs, you can kind of get away with less gears. But every engine is going to benefit by keeping it in its power band. So the smaller engines especially wanted more gears. The more gears you have, the more time you can spend in that optimal zone. So when they came out with the Turbo 700 R4, of course I jumped on it, and it was essentially a hydraulic driven transmission. So the valve body and all that was just like the old Turbo 350. They did add a torque converter clutch inside the converter, which was a pretty simple thing. It was on and off. And I remember back when I first started doing swaps in the Toyota pickups and the Land Cruisers, guy says, oh, you can't make the TCC or the torque converter clutch work on these Turbo 700 R4s. And of course I figured out all you had to do was power a wire or ground a wire, I don't remember which, and that would engage the converter. But the thing about that was you didn't want to engage it at certain times. Like, you didn't want to engage it when you came to a stop, otherwise the engine would die. So GM had some electronics that would sense when you got to a cruise in a certain gear, and after so much time you would engage the converter, and then as soon as, of course, if you touched the brake or you accelerated hard or whatever, the converter clutch would disengage. Now, I had a switch on the dash of my personal vehicle, and I could operate that torque converter clutch manually. When I got on the highway, I turned it on, and I had a light that would indicate it was on, and then of course I could turn it off if it came to a stop. And I remember a few times forgetting to turn it off. So a couple of companies came out with these retro kits that would sense the brake and the cruise and all that, and you just hook it up and it would run that torque converter clutch. Now, that torque converter clutch was also discrete, which means it was just on and off. Today's torque converters are much more advanced. They are pulse width modulated. You can bring the converter clutch in as much as you want, anywhere from 0 to 100%. And I know on these 10 speeds and 8 speeds, especially the 10 speed, GM spent a ton of time on this 10 speed. They had a collaboration with Ford and Honda and Toyota. They made a small torque converter, lightweight, to reduce rotational forces. They did everything they could to make the 10 speed as efficient as possible. So when you're driving one of these 10 speeds and you're going down the road in a traditional, let's say, 5 speed, 6 speed, even a 4 speed, you get on it, normally the transmission would downshift to get you in the power band. But because you have so many gears, and if you give it just a bit of throttle and you don't have to accelerate real hard, you'll feel that torque converter unlock. Or if it's not discrete, you'll just feel the converter start to slip more. And you go. You don't have to downshift. And I've noticed that was really prominent since the 6L80 on. So again, the transmission is keeping the engine in the optimal power band. You guys with manual transmissions know, if you have in too high of a gear, you're going to lug the engine. If you're in too low of a gear, you're over revving the engine. An automatic is pretty much going to be in the gear that it needs to be in. Do you guys remember the old CAGs, computer-aided gear selection? GM tried. It was another gimmick the government liked to increase fuel economy. And if you were shifting, let's say, a Corvette from the 1980s, and you were under light acceleration, it would literally lock out the next gear. So what it would do is it would skip gears. So instead of going the next gear up, it might go 2 gears up. And there was electronic solenoids that would block out that next gear. Now, of course, if you got on it, it would unlock that gear. And of course, most guys just deleted that whole thing. But that was an attempt to get you to upshift quickly to get better economy. Now, the manual transmission really hasn't changed a lot. You basically have a flywheel and a pressure plate and a disc. And when you push a pedal, whether it's hydraulic clutch or mechanical, and boy, I remember those days trying to adjust the mechanical clutches, especially the Borgenbecks, the long Borgenbecks. Diaphragms were pretty easy to work with. You could get chatter. There was just all sorts of issues with manuals if you didn't do it right. But basically, when you let the clutch out, you have a direct link between the engine and the drive shaft. And whatever gear you're selected in the transmission is what you're going to have. The beauty of an automatic is it will make that selection for you, and having torque multiplication and a torque converter means it will handle all that operation for you. Now, there were some clutchless manuals. I don't know if you guys, and there was a vacuum thing. I think Porsche, Volkswagen, and a few others offered it to try to get rid of the clutch. But the bottom line is, I feel automatic transmissions have evolved to the point that they outperform the manuals. You'll notice now that when it comes to fuel economy, the automatics and the manuals are listed about the same. When it comes to off-road performance or on-road performance, the automatic really is kind of unmatched. When it comes to drag racing and launching, there's some really sophisticated clutches out there that cost thousands and thousands of dollars to basically mimic what an automatic does, and that is how to get the power to the ground. If you look at some of the new vehicles with launch control, it's just amazing how fast these things can get off the line. I mean, you look at cars going 3 seconds, 0 to 60. Basically, these guys are revving the motor up, getting the motor in its power band, pushing a button, or letting the brake off, and the automatic does the rest. Now, could you do that with a manual? Maybe. I remember back in the day, it took a really good driver to match the performance of an automatic with a manual transmission car. I have a 930 Porsche, as you guys know, and they said it could do 0 to 60 in 5 seconds. Motor Trend, all these magazines, said it was one of the fastest cars of the day. But the problem is you had to thrash the clutch. That car had pretty tall gears in it because it was a highway car designed for the Autobahn to go really fast. So launching it off the line can be very difficult. Now, when the magazine guys would get in it, rev it up, drop the clutch, they'd produce those fast times, but they'd also break the clutch. And I remember back then, I forgot what publication it was, but they said it was $1,300 every time you did a fast launch because you had to replace the clutch. Now, $1,300 back then would equate to far, far more today. I remember the Porsche 944s, was it? Anyway, they had torsion tubes, and replacing the clutch was a massive job. Not like a Camaro where you pull 4 bolts out, the transmission falls out, you take the bell housing off, and the clutch is right there. So between launch control, torque multiplication, lowering friction, that's always been a problem with automatic transmissions, is high friction. Well, you got a lot of parts moving. So with a new generation of transmissions, and I did read some stuff on the 10L80, it is pretty amazing what they're doing. They're using exotic metals, they're reducing the diameter of parts, they're shaving off everything they can everywhere to reduce the internal friction of the transmission. They've even gone to low viscosity and ultra low viscosity fluids, because again, it's going to reduce friction. But I can tell you the end result is, in a small engine, it's very dramatic. Because in a small engine that doesn't have long legs, you can keep that engine in its power band. I had a 9-speed Pentastar in my Caravan, and I was really impressed how well it pulled that Caravan. Now, they don't do very good in a 5-speed JK because they have a lot less gears in a heavy vehicle. But in that little Caravan, that 9-speed, when it worked right, and that was an issue, it always kept that little Pentastar right there in its power band. And with dual overhead cams and cam phasing and everything else, we were never lacking for power in that vehicle. Now, when I said working right, as manufacturers developed the automatic and went from the 4-speed into the what I call high gear transmissions, they did run into a lot of issues. Most of you probably know the W8580, the 5-speed, while better than the 4-speed, was far from ideal. They did some funny business with the gears and that, and it really wasn't a modern transmission in my opinion. But when they did start stepping up into the 6, 7, 8, 9 speeds, logic became very important. What I mean by that is early transmissions are basically valve body driven. So when you went a certain speed, I remember they used to have on the GM transmissions, I forgot what they call it, but it was a centrifugal weight that would spin around. You take this cover off, it's that bulbous cover on the side, on the left side of the transmission, and you could add weight or take weight off. It was like the centrifugal advance in a distributor. Like the Corvettes had very low weight, and they would shift harder. You add a lot of weight to it, and they'd shift smoother. So everything was mechanical or hydraulic. There really was no electronics involved. But as these high gear transmissions came out, of course, they went to a transmission control module. The early ones went to a PCM, that's a powertrain control module, versus an engine control module, because in most cases the powertrain control module controlled the engine and the transmission. So if you look at an LS1, the LS1B computer is a powertrain module. It does the engine and transmission. And I think that brings us up to the 4L60, which is one of the first modern GM electronically controlled transmissions. Some of you guys ask me, well, is a 4L60 the same as a 4L60E? And yeah, it is. The E just stands for electronically controlled. GM improved it over the years, and the 4L60 was really not much more than a Turbo 700 that was updated to electronic control. So they put solenoids in there that were electronically controlled, and a module would then operate those solenoids. There was a lot of advantages to that. Of course, you have better control over the transmission than just using bob weights and hydraulic circuits. There was a downside to it too. The early 4-speeds were pretty complicated because you had a ton of wires going between the transmission and the control module. And if you take an LS1B, for example, you have the Prindle or the internal mode switch, you have all the solenoids, power circuits, ground circuits, brake, and you're running all these wires up the tunnel to a controller. And I remember in the Chevy trucks, wire chafing was a problem, and the transmission would freak out. So one of the benefits of the 6L80 was they put the transmission control module into the valve body, which I actually liked. That eliminated a ton of wires. Now you had to have the CAN wires, the power ground, and a brake signal, a hardwired brake signal to the transmission. But it's just a handful of wires in the 6L80. They did go back to a externally mounted TCM in the 8 and the 10 speed, just like most of the other manufacturers. And I'm not sure what the reasoning was for that. I think it was the servicing of the TCM in the 6L80 was just such a pain. You had to pull the valve body out. I'm still kind of a fan of that, but I could see the benefit of just replacing a external TCM. An interesting note, when they went to the Gen 4 engine, the Gen 4 engines were designed for an engine control module, not a powertrain control module. So GM had to develop a special TCM, it's the T42 controller, for the 4-speed transmissions. And the early LSs had this T42 controller. So rather than all these wires going up into a powertrain control module, they went up into a TCM. Then the TCM had a CAN interface to the ECM. So it was one extra step to get control of the transmission to the ECM. I wasn't a big fan of that in the early builds that we did. And we went to the 6L80, it eliminated that external TCM and all the wires that went to it for the solenoid control and such. So the 6L80 build is just much easier. A lot of guys say, hey, can I just throw a 6-speed in my 4-speed? And you really can't without changing the main harness out, because all those wires are integrated into the main powertrain harness with the 4-speed transmission. So moving on, all the manufacturers, as far as I know, had problems with the high gear transmission. And it was because of logic. I had a 7-speed Mercedes back in 2006, and it was a nightmare. It had what they called adaptive learning, which is common today. But the problem with adaptive learning is it could go the wrong way. It could learn the wrong way, and that's what my Mercedes would do. It was an electromechanical interface where it had springs and solenoids and all this stuff, and it would try to predict and determine shift pressures based on driving. And it had mathematical calculations that would try to reach that goal. It's kind of the same thing today when you do a solenoid characterization or adaptive learning in any of the new transmissions, but back then it really wasn't that well understood. So my Mercedes would start learning the wrong way, and the transmission would just start banging and clunking, and I take it to Mercedes, and they didn't really know what to do. They talked to Germany, and after a while they replaced some springs and some mechanical stuff and software updates, and they got it to work pretty good. But it was a learning experience. My 9-speed Chrysler most of the time it was pretty good. But there were situations where it would just do crazy stuff, where you would think it would upshift, but it would downshift, or it would clunk really hard. Now, I will say, as the software updates came through, it got better and better. GM had the same problem. The early 6L80s, I'm going to say 7 and 8, had some issues with software and maybe even some hardware. But by 9, 10, I got a 9.6L80 in my personal Rubicon, well over 100,000 miles with no issues. In 10, though, GM did go to a new operating system with a 6L80, and I got to say, you want to get a 10 and up 6L80. Don't mess around with a 7, 8, or 9. And that goes with a 6L92. And the 6L80 became one of my favorite transmissions, and it still is. I found it to be reliable. It runs cool. It's low friction, low heat. It's got a good gear spread. Now, you're going to hear guys out there, especially the non-GM guys, say, oh, the 6L80 is not a real modern transmission. It is a real modern transmission. It is adaptive. It has really wide, diverse gearing, and I'm a big fan of it. When the 8-speed came out in 2015-ish, I had a lot of reservations because I didn't know if a big 6.2 liter or even a 5.3 needed those 2 extra gears. And you combine that with the fact that GM was having some problems with the 8-speed when they released it, just like everybody else. I remember driving the ZF transmissions in the Ram trucks. They all had issues. And the learning took forever. When you put an 8-speed in, GM would tell their customers, wait a week, 2 weeks, a month before it shifts right. And they just never were right. Now, of course, they had a lot of updates. And I got to say, some of the best shifting JKs we have 15 transmissions in them after they were updated. But some of the others, we just had to fight and fight and fight to get mediocre results. So by about 17, GM had most of those issues solved with the 8-speed, but it was kind of too late. The 8-speed had built this reputation as being a bad transmission, and it wasn't bad because it was weak. It's not. It's actually very strong. In fact, the 8-speed is probably the transmission of choice. If you got a supercharged engine, you got 43-inch tires, and you're going to thrash it, it's really a strong transmission. The problem with the 8-speed was drivability, clunking, clanking. I've got a 17 Denali, and 17 was about the year they really straightened things out. They did have some issues with the fluid. They made these transmissions at really tight tolerances, and the viscosity of the fluid meant that it wouldn't get where it needed to go, especially early in the morning. So you would get this clunking and lurching, and I gotta say that my 17 Denali does do a little bit of that. Once you get it out of like second gear, get it into third gear, it's beautiful. But under certain conditions, especially in the cold, and yes, I have a home in Utah and it's been very cold there, you'll get some clanking and clunking, and it's nothing dramatic. We did put the blue fluid in, as GM calls it, which is the lower viscosity, or I'm not sure what they did. They changed the fluid, and that did help. And now my wife drives that vehicle every day and doesn't even notice that there's a problem with the transmission. RJL is one of the best shifting Jeeps that we've done, and it's got an 8L90 in it, and I think it's a 15, and it hasn't been updated, and it's just beautiful. But what I can say about the 10-speed is right out of the box, we've had very, very few issues with the 10-speed. As you know, Motec's always in the forefront of this technology, so we started doing the 10-speeds right away, and like I said, there was very few issues with it. The only issue we really had with the 10-speed with guys overheating it. You know, they had 40s, and they blocked their grill, and they didn't have a good tranny cooler and all that. So the one thing that can kill any transmission is overheating it. Make sure you got a gauge in your transmission. Make sure you can put a big cooler on it and keep that transmission cool. But little beknownst to us, in about 2019, GM switched to a 19 controller and a Type 2 10-speed transmission. And they are awesome transmissions. They shift out of the box really, really well. You can feel that these 10-speed Type 2 transmissions had a lot of expertise go into them. Just the way they shift. If you're on the throttle hard, they shift firm. If you're just rolling the throttle on and cruising, you can't even feel the shift. And the Type 2 is an awesome transmission. And don't overlook the Type 1. They're great transmissions also. But what GM did in the Type 2 is they locked down the controller, the T93. And at first we couldn't use that controller because nobody supported it. And I actually met with a guy that helped lock the bootloader down, and I remember him bragging about locking those bootloaders down and nobody was going to be able to crack it. And he might have been right, because like on the 19ZR1 Corvette and others, you go to HP Tuners and they don't support that controller. They simply replace it. But every week, every month, they're cracking more and more of these controllers, and GM is stepping things up. And believe it or not, guys, GM's not the enemy here. They are under pressure from the government to lock these things down because, especially with the diesel trucks, they build a Duramax and a guy goes out and buys a Bully Dog or whatever and cranks in another 100 horsepower. Now he is in violation of federal emission standards. But to make the government happy, GM had to bow to the pressure and lock these controllers down. And I heard the NSA actually helped GM lock these bootloaders down. Now, we've been supporting the Type 2 10-speed now for over a year. And I'm driving one right now, and I can tell you, once you drive one of these, you're probably never going to want to go back to anything else. It does work a little bit different than the traditional 3-speed, 4-speed, even the 6-speed, because you're always in the proper gear. No matter what you're doing, whether you're crawling, you're on the highway at 80 miles an hour, you're in traffic, the engine is always in the power band. Now, I didn't think I was going to like that. I like engines with a wide power band, and I would trade that off for high-end horsepower. Meaning, if you got an engine that comes in at 4,000 RPM, that's not going to do you a whole lot of good crawling in traffic or crawling off-road. I'd rather have an engine whose power band comes in right off idle and pulls me up to about 4,000 RPM, because that's where I'm at 99% of the time. So that's what these transmissions do, is they allow the engine to run in that power band virtually all the time. Now, when you get on a hard, of course, they let the transmission rev up, but that's a very small percentage of your driving. So the 10-speed is amazing. The drivability is second to none. It's extremely smooth to the point you don't even know it's shifting. Slight changes in load, going up hills, going down hills, it'll make a gear change and go up or down 100 RPM. You barely feel it. Nothing like the old Star with a 5-speed where it downshifts and it's 2,000 RPM and there's all the drama associated with that. Also, the 10-speed is going to lead to better economy because, especially if you gear right, and guys, you got to gear right. You can't gear a 10-speed LT 35s with 513 gears. You got to load these things down. GM's putting really, really tall gears in these. I want to see that RPM at or below 2,000 RPM at 70 miles an hour. That's going to get you the economy, the drivability you want. But let me just finish this by saying a big part of your engine conversion in your Jeep is the transmission, and consider that. If you have the choice between a 5-speed Hemi and an 8-speed Hemi, get the 8-speed. If you have an option between a 4-speed LS or a 6-speed, get the 6-speed. You're going to be much happier in the long run, in my opinion. Now, we got the guys out there still waving the flag for the 4-speed, and I'm not going to say that they're wrong. In certain situations, you know, you're out in Baja racing or whatever, that 4-speed might be awesome. But as far as just general driving and off-roading and wheeling, these transmissions have proven themselves, in my opinion, and there's no reason not to take advantage of it. So we're going to hit the trail, and we will see you shortly.